the Jewish Channel's Week in Review. Gilad Shalit is released and Israel celebrates. The House Majority Leader discusses Jewish values of charity, anti-Semitism at the United Nations, and more of the Jewish news that's changing your world right now on this episode of the Week in Review. Hello and welcome to the Jewish Channel's Week in Review. I'm Stephen I. Weiss. Gilad Shalit has returned home to Israel. The 25-year-old Israeli soldier was captured by Hamas 5.5 years ago at the age of 19, where there had been no news of negotiations for Shalit or even any proof of life since a 2009 video. News leaked out early last week that negotiations on a deal to release Shalit could be coming. 3 days after Yom Kippur, the office of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu announced that a deal had been finalized. 1 week later, Shalit made the helicopter trip to Tel Nof Air Force Base in Israel, where he was greeted by the Israel Defense Forces and the Prime Minister. In exchange for Shalit, Israel agreed to release more than 1,000 Palestinian prisoners, including many who'd participated in or planned terrorist attacks against Israeli civilians. The deal strengthens approval for Hamas and Netanyahu at a crucial time for the political success of both. Shalit was captured on June 25, 2006, during a raid into Gaza. The events that day started with Palestinians entering Israel from Gaza through an underground tunnel and attacking an Israeli army post. Shalit's tank was hit by a rocket-propelled grenade, leaving him wounded, and he was captured by those Palestinians and brought to Gaza. 2 Israeli soldiers were killed in that attack, and 3 others were wounded. At that time, Fatah's Palestinian Authority, led by Mahmoud Abbas, was still in control of Gaza, but Abbas either could not or would not get Shalit's captors to hand him over. Rescue efforts failed, and Shalit became a symbol in captivity of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict for years to come. His return to Israel this week marks the first time an Israeli prisoner of war has been returned alive in nearly 30 years. The most recent prisoner exchange for Israel was in 2008, when Israel released 5 Lebanese men and hundreds of Lebanese and Palestinian deceased in exchange for the bodies of Israeli soldiers Ehud Goldwasser and Eldad Regev. There are now 6 remaining Israeli soldiers characterized as missing in action. Zachary Baumel, Tzvi Feldman, and Yehuda Katz were part of a group of 5 soldiers captured in a battle in Lebanon in 1982. The 2 other soldiers in that group were, until this week, the last imprisoned soldiers returned to Israel alive. Rona Rad was captured after his fighter plane went down over Lebanon in 1986, and Guy Hever and Majdi Halabi went missing in 1997 and 2005, respectively. Shalit's return this week became the subject of much celebration. Special T-shirts commemorating the occasion were on sale, and Israelis and Jews around the world watched the slow progress as Shalit gradually made his way to Israel on Tuesday, October 18th. Shalit was handed over to Israeli officials in Egypt, underwent a medical examination, and then was flown by helicopter to Tel Nof. In an apparent propaganda effort tied to his release, Shalit granted interviews to Palestinian and Egyptian media, in which he said, among other things, "I will be very happy if all Palestinian prisoners are freed so that they can go back to their loved ones, their territory, and their families." The likelihood that Shalit's words were crafted in the interview to satisfy his Hamas captors is emphasized by the fact that his Hamas captors are actually watching over his shoulder during the interview. In contrast to Shalit's call in that interview, Israel didn't give up all of its approximately 6,000 Palestinian prisoners, but it has promised the return of more than 1,000 of them, and as of Tuesday, a select 477 prisoners had been freed, either returned to Palestinian territory or deported to locations like Turkey. Exactly who will be in that second group of Palestinian prisoners released will be determined in the coming months, but Israel did release the names of the 477 prisoners released this week. They include men involved in some of the most notorious terrorist attacks on Israeli civilians, including the 2001 bombing of a Sparrow's Pizza Parlor that killed 15 people, the 2001 bombing of a Tel Aviv nightclub that killed 21 people, and a 2002 suicide bombing in a hotel that killed 29 people. The list also includes the founders of Hamas's terrorist wing. Most of the 477 will return to their homes in the West Bank, and more than 100 will return to Gaza, but approximately 40 of them will be deported to other countries. Of those 40, some will have the opportunity to apply to return after a period of 3 years. Despite the personal anguish for Israeli victims' families and likely security concerns for the country as a whole in releasing these men, a poll after the deal was announced showed 79% of Israelis supporting the deal. At least several families of victims of those released filed petitions with the government to try to forestall the release, but their petitions were unsuccessful. The deal clearly boosts the political fortune of Hamas and alters the balance of power in Palestinian leadership at the same time the Palestinian rival faction Fatah is seeking Palestinian statehood at the United Nations. Moving on to a different issue at the United Nations, Rebecca Honig-Friedman reports on the 10th anniversary of a UN conference in which international leaders floated the idea that Zionism is racism.
It's a cause for celebration for many countries, but those who sympathize with Israel find less to be joyful about. The 10th anniversary of the United Nations World Conference Against Racism, also known as Durban I, took place last month, and B'nai B'rith International convened its own event to assess the impact of the famous conference, and of anti-Semitism within the United Nations. International leaders shared their views on what all agreed is a growing threat to Israel and the Jewish people.
Wish I had good news to report.
The administration of President Barack Obama has a special envoy to combat anti-Semitism, and she said that the problem of anti-Jewish sentiment goes far beyond the United Nations.
Now, the traditional forms of anti-Semitism that we have grown to almost expect are alive and well and disgustingly growing on every continent on the globe.
And that anti-Semitism infected the UN, according to the panelists, at that first Durban conference 10 years ago. A Canadian Parliament member summed it up neatly.
A conference against racism that was supposed to be a world conference against racism turned into a conference of racism against Israel and the Jewish people.
And that trend of anti-Israel sentiment has continued in the UN since then, according to John Bolton, a former ambassador to the United Nations under George W. Bush. Bolton made no bones about his contempt for the UN, saying that an address by Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, scheduled for the next day, was par for the course there.
Tomorrow will not just be a bad day for the UN, sort of an aberration. This is what happens every day.
And at the UN and elsewhere, anti-Israeli sentiment is increasingly a cover for anti-Semitism. Jewish organizational leader Malcolm Hoenlein argued.
But it's not still, 70 years after the Shoah, politically correct to say I hate Jews, but you can't say I hate Israel or I hate Zionists.
To hear what these international leaders have to say about distinguishing between anti-Israel criticism and anti-Semitism, tune into the full broadcast version of the Week in Review.
Thank you, Rebecca. Turning to domestic politics, arguments in Washington of late have focused on how federal dollars should be spent. And for many Jews, that's meant questions about whether spending priorities are helping out those in need. For observant Jew and House Majority Leader Eric Cantor, those issues are doubly relevant. And for billionaire Jewish philanthropist Michael Steinhardt, the question of whether Jews themselves are doing enough for those in need is part of the equation. Christian Neen reports.
House Majority Leader Eric Cantor and billionaire philanthropist Michael Steinhardt are two of the most prominent Jews in very different fields: congressional leadership and private Jewish funding. They were brought together last week by Rabbi Shmuley Boteach to discuss how Jewish values inform their work. And there were surprising statements from Cantor, who has led such a fierce charge for fiscal conservatism that he's even caught many Republicans off guard. For this Jewish crowd, he explained how his financial restraint meets charitable goals.
And as you say, even the Torah talks about the fulfillment of self-sufficiency being the utmost goal of dignity. Well, it's not that easy, because there are plenty of people out there who frankly can't help themselves. They need our help. Well, we need to make sure that we're going to have the wherewithal, the resources to address those needs, which is what the majority in Congress has been about since January of this year. We've been about trying to fix the problem. The problem is this federal government of ours is spending entirely much more money than it has.
It's a sentiment that hit home with the philanthropist Steinhardt.
Particularly as Eric was speaking, the thought occurred to me that while I basically agree, I've been a capitalist all my life, with what Eric is saying, there's a big point that hasn't been mentioned here, and that is that the capitalist system over the last X years, I don't know how many, has really become painfully corrupt, and that those of us who've been engaged in the system have seen so much unfairness, so many people who've done well by not doing well, that there's a sense that the system doesn't quite work anymore.
To see more from this event, please tune in to the full broadcast edition of the Week in Review.
Thank you, Christian. Moving on from how Jews are performing on the traditional issue of charity to how they're upholding religious traditions, this week was the Jewish holiday of Sukkot, traditionally observed by dwelling in temporary huts. But getting that hut on wheels or to a month-long protest of the financial industry takes some doing, as Meredith Gansman found out.
Sukkah on a bike, sukkah on a truck, sukkah at Occupy Wall Street. There are plenty of unusual sukkahs in unusual places this year. Sukkot is the Jewish harvest festival celebrated by eating and often sleeping outside in a temporary hut or a sukkah. And for Jews on the go, sukkahs are traveling with a whole new look. When 18-year-old Levi Duchman, a Chabad Lubavitch Yeshiva student from Crown Heights, saw pedicabs swerve in and out of New York City traffic 2 years ago, he thought they would be the perfect carrier for a sukkah. Now you can see several petty sukkahs making their way around New York City throughout the holiday.
Many Jews do not have the chance to have a sukkah, to build a sukkah in New York. So what we do is we bring the sukkah to you.
The sukkah mobiles, which the Chabad Lubavitch developed in the mid-1970s, park on the street, inviting passing Jews in to observe the holiday. I got a chance to shake a lulav and etrog inside. Another Chabad emissary, Levi Pekar, showed me what he said are the two biggest mobile sukkahs in the world.
These two trucks, each of them 48 feet long, are the two largest trucks in the world, and physically they can't get any larger. There's no way we could physically build any larger ones. They're built so Jews could be able to eat outside two very prominent restaurants here in Manhattan, and there would be enough space for everybody to eat. It's also very good. It's very large. It's not as an advertisement, but a way for Jews to walk down the street and say, this is my sukkah, it's large, it belongs to each and every one of us.
Sukkahs on top of flatbed trucks and petty sukkahs are making celebrating the holiday of Sukkot more accessible. But at a mass protest for Occupy Wall Street, multiple sukkahs stand for a bigger message. Occupy Wall Street is a temporary community where thousands of protesters have gathered to criticize the financial industry. Amidst the demonstrators, the signs, and the beating drums, the Occupy Judaism movement is being led by Daniel Saratsky, a Jewish organizational professional at Repair the World.
Look, Jews are committed to values of social justice, but we talk a good talk and we rarely walk the walk. And if we really want to express those values in a meaningful way, then we need to pray with our legs, as Abraham Joshua Heschel said, and really get out into the world and stand up for justice.
For more from Sukkot at Occupy Wall Street, tune into the full broadcast version of the Week in Review.
Thank you, Meredith. That's all for this week. From all of us here at the Jewish Channel, be well. The Jewish Channel is available on cable. Time Warner Cable Channel 528, IO Optimum Channel 291, RCN Channel 268, Bright House Channel 330, Verizon Fios Channel 900, Cox Channel 1, Frontier Communications, and now on Comcast Cable in the on-demand menu under Premium Channels. For more information, visit tjctv.com.